Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for participating in today's virtual tour, or Yes in God's Backyard virtual tour. We're just kind of bringing everybody in from the waiting room here, so we'll get started here in just a minute. But just want to thank you all for attending, and in just a minute we'll go ahead and get started with it. Okay, well, I think we've got everybody in from the waiting room. Thanks again so much for participating today. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I'm going to look for a video, somebody's screen that will give me a thumbs up that you can hear me okay. Brittany, will you give me a quick text that you can hear me? Just make sure we got audio working. Perfect. Okay. All right. Well, thanks again for coming and spending some of your afternoon with us. Welcome to the Yes in God's Backyard virtual tour. We sort of joked that we thought that the original version of this we would paint a school bus and sort of travel throughout the Treasure Valley with this panel discussion and do this in person, but obviously things have changed, and so the virtual tour is our format for today. So I know that there's always some good and some challenging things about the virtual format, but we're going to do it the best we possibly can to make it interactive. And so I want to introduce myself. I'm Bart Cochran. I am the founder and the executive director of Leap Housing Solutions. And we are hopeful that today, in this meeting, that you will gain inspiration about how faith communities can be powerful actors in solving the affordable housing crisis. So before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping items for our time today. This is meant to be an exercise in what we would call discovery. And so in that spirit, we want this to be as interactive as possible. And so while we present and we hear from the panelists, we encourage you to ask questions. So the way that the format for doing that in this setting is that we'd love for you to write your questions. You can use the chat feature that's at the bottom of the screen. And if you want to send you can ask a question, it'll show to everyone. Or you can send the question directly to Brittany Zanders, who's in the list of folks who are participating. So it says Brittany Zanders and it says -leap. And the question can go directly to her. She'll grab all those questions and then we'll pick them all up at the end of the meeting during the Q&A portion. And if there's time, we'll go ahead and go to live questions. But we just wanted to make sure that in case we're limited on time, that we catch at least all the written questions before we finish the presentation today. So the other thing is we're going to be recording the presentation today. We just want to make sure that everybody knows that the reason for our recording of it is that for those who couldn't participate with us today, we just want to make sure that there's an opportunity for them to see the recording of this presentation. And so a final note, if you know somebody who's missed this event, or there's other folks from your faith community, or somebody comes to mind while you're in this meeting, we have a second meeting on the 24th, and that's at 6 p.m. So that was meant for folks that couldn't join during the daytime. And so that's February 24th at 6 p.m. You can register on our website, and it will be the same format. So essentially the same meeting. So it's not a part two, it's just another time slot so that we could have as many people participate and attend as possible. So we're super thankful for the just the interest in this meeting and the attendance today. And so now with that, we just want to get started. If you haven't heard of LEAP before today, we're a local nonprofit organization with a mission of developing and preserving affordable housing while providing empowering services that lead to greater housing stability. So LEAP runs 6 housing programs in the Treasure Valley, including the building and development of new housing and perpetually stewarding affordable homeownership through the first of its kind locally, the LEAP Housing Trust. So LEAP Housing Solutions works with organizations from a variety of faith backgrounds and does not require any of its partners, clients, or agents to subscribe to a particular set of religious or non-religious beliefs. While LEAP is not a faith-based organization, it identifies as a faith-informed organization because of its founding and that it was inspired out of a faith-filled call to action. So therefore, sort of along with others in the community, LEAP regularly works with faith-based organizations who have particular programs, land, funding, desires, or abilities that best enable LEAP to fulfill its mission. So why YIGBY? So just so everybody is on the same page about what in the world is this new term that we're throwing around. So YIGBY stands for Yes in God's Backyard. YIGBY, in our view, is a faith community play on words as the opposite of Not in My Backyard or NIMBY. So this play on words, it's not just here locally, has begun to serve as a call to action for faith communities throughout the US who are powerfully positioned to alleviate the housing crisis. And I would just put a little asterisk there that I would argue that faith communities are not only positioned to alleviate, but I think solve the housing crisis. So I recently wrote in a Idaho Business Review guest opinion that affordable housing is a water cooler issue these days. It seems most everyone has a touch point with these challenges, whether it's somebody you know that's struggling to pay rising rents, or someone feeling the pinch because of property taxes increasing as home values move up. I just want to make sure it's clear that this is not just a felt need, the numbers back it up. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition reports that Idaho's affordable housing deficit is over 24,000 housing units. As you can imagine, much of this is concentrated in the Treasure Valley, and to contextualize how big of a hill this is to climb, in a really good year in the Treasure Valley, 200 to 300 new units of affordable housing might get created. Most years, it's much lower than that. And so the numbers go on, and I won't stay here for very long here, but because most of you know these facts because you've read them, you've heard them. Again, it's a water cooler issue, but 1 in 3 households are considered low income at 80% of area median income. Home values have increased nearly 4 times the rate of wage increases. And median home prices in some areas have peaked over $400,000. And so those numbers go on and on. We can slice and dice the lots of different ways, but I think you get the point. So as an organization that is faith-informed, we ask the question, what can faith communities do? And so our answer, of course, is that we believe that faith communities can simply say yes in God's backyard. To talk about the backyard, we did a brief study. We looked at 168 faith communities in the Treasure Valley and determined there to be approximately 180 acres of unused or excess land. To put this into context, cumulatively, this is larger than the 100 plus acre Boise State campus. This doesn't include every church, of course, in the Treasure Valley, and frankly, not all land is suitable for housing. But I think you get the point. There's incredible potential among faith communities in the Treasure Valley to create housing. So today, we invite you to partner with us to create affordable housing. The exciting part is that there is much inspiration to draw from. We don't have to be the first ones to figure this out. The examples abound, such as the Clarendon Baptist Church. They're on the left-hand side of the screen here. In the DC area, they repositioned their property to create 70 units of affordable housing while keeping their sanctuary intact. Not to mention, you can see the steeple as well. The Portsmouth Union Church, which is in the bottom right corner, is the Portsmouth Union Church is in Portland, and they decided to tear down an underutilized fellowship hall to make space for 20 units on a relatively small lot for affordable housing. And then the Wesley Village, United Methodist Church in California, that redeveloped underutilized church land to create 41 units of affordable housing, and get this, including senior housing, adult daycare, a free health clinic, and a Head Start program. And so I've visited all three of these projects, and they are just as exciting as they sound. So today, though, we're going to be talking about local inspiration. So we want to provide local inspiration for you, and that's where our panel comes in. So thanks to 4 local faith community leaders for sharing their time with us today to share how they are working to solve the affordable housing challenge. So I'm going to turn it over now to the panel so they can share their thoughts, of which I've posed 3 questions. Now I've allotted for 10 minutes for each speaker, and there'll be a Q&A at the end for you to ask questions. And please remember again to type the questions to Brittany if you've got any that you can write down. Otherwise, we'll hopefully find some time to do live questions at the end. Those 3 questions, so just so you hear them now, I'm not going to prompt the speakers with those 3 questions, but I want you to hear them now. They're aware of them, and then they'll speak directly about them. So the first question: why did you and your faith community become involved with affordable housing? How has your involvement impacted your faith community? And what would you share with other faith communities considering getting involved in affordable housing? So under the first panelist, I'm excited to introduce Megan Manlove. She has been serving as the pastor of Trinity Lutheran Church for over 10 years. Trinity Lutheran took ownership of Trinity New Hope in 2015, a 16-unit affordable housing project built on excess land. Trinity New Hope, I should say excess church land, so land that's directly adjacent to the church. Trinity New Hope's vision, I think particularly an inspiring one, so everybody get this, that everyone in Nampa would have a clean, safe home in which to live. So everyone. And so with that, Megan, I want to turn it over to you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Bart. So yeah, I'm going to back up the story just a little bit. And there it is. There's our 16 units. Thank you. And our church is there too. So in the mid-1990s, Trinity was discerning what to do with our excess land, wanted to do something positive. Meanwhile, the Sisters of Mercy, the same sisters who created Mercy Hospital, were looking to build affordable housing in West Nampa. So a 50-year ground lease agreement was signed and the 16 single-family units were built. Then, as Bart alluded to, in 2015, Mercy Housing wanted to leave Nampa. The congregation still felt called to use its land for housing, so we created a separate nonprofit. It's no secret that we have a shortage of affordable housing in the Treasure Valley. Our mortgage is with Idaho Housing and Finance, and this housing, these 16 units, are now what's technically referred to as Section 42 housing. So as we were making the decision, one of the scripture passages that really guided me was Matthew 25, Jesus' parable of the sheep and the goats. He doesn't talk about housing explicitly, he talks about feeding, clothing, visiting those in prison. But I think housing, it fits the spirit of the text and the parable. I also leaned into Martin Luther's Small Catechism. He adds an imperative, a positive, to his explanations of the "you shall not" command, and they all have to do with neighbor love. So, for example, talking about the command, "you shall not murder," Luther says we are to fear and love God so that we neither endanger nor harm the lives of our neighbors, but instead help and support them in all of life's needs. So Trinity New Hope is about following the command to love as we've been loved, to love our neighbor. It's also now, many years into this, about being good stewards of this legacy that leaders have left to us. So one of the next question Bart asked was, how has our involvement impacted the faith community? And I actually polled some of our church members, and I'm going to read their quotes directly. One member said, "Trinity New Hope is part of why I first came to Trinity. It gives witness to the congregation's commitment to serving the community. Trinity New Hope is one indication that Trinity Lutheran Church has a living and active faith that has real-world implications, rather than being a Jesus-centric social club." Another member wrote, "I think we've gained from other Christians or non-Christians for serving people with low-income housing, kind of like putting our money and energies where our gospel is." And this final quote is a little bit longer. "Jesus taught that true faith is shown in feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, housing the homeless, which often involves going outside our group of Sunday morning worshipers. We have Trinity New Hope houses on the perimeter of our parking lot where we can see the children playing in the yard. We have its business office inside our education wing. We have church members serving on its board of directors. We participate in activities that support the residents. And each time we show up at 8 South Midland or drive by, we are reminded that faith is not about what we want, need, but about selfless ministry to the world. Our participation makes us a more hopeful and less self-centered congregation." So just a few things to think about that I thought were worth also passing on. As I reflected on this whole journey that we've been on, proximity is really important. It would have been very different if these houses had been, like if we'd gotten a piece of land donated 4 miles away and they decided to do this with the property. The fact, as my last quote illustrated, that we see this every time we pull into our church parking lot is profound. So there's something very powerful about seeing the housing. I would say it's transformative. As far as the actual process when we acquired the properties from Mercy Housing, transparency. I mean, anybody who's been in ministry and made any big decisions or any nonprofit just knows that it's very difficult to over communicate with people. I'm so glad that we just meetings, letters, everything, sitting in people's kitchens and explaining kind of where we were going. All of that time was time very well spent. And then know the phone calls that you can make. Pull your leadership together and think about the bankers, attorneys, accountants, real estate agents that you can call and find someone who takes great minutes. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Megan. I really appreciate it. This always one of the downsides to a virtual meeting, right, is that we might be applauding or affirming that Megan's comments were awesome. So I just saw Joe air clapping, and know that we would all be doing that, and maybe we're all doing that behind our mute buttons, Megan. But thanks so much for your comments and for sharing your thoughts. The next person I want to introduce, next two people I want to introduce we'll start with Kathleen Kat Tigerman, a Lutheran deaconess, was brought on as the first director of the house next door. In 2015, Kat has worked for a variety of churches and nonprofit organizations, both domestic and abroad. And the house next door exists to support single mothers and their children and provide them with rent-free housing while the mothers work on their educational degrees. It is the nonprofit's goal to help young women become successful and self-sufficient and thereby improve the quality of life for themselves, their children, and their community. And then our second speaker who's with Kat is Karen Hunter. And Karen was ordained in 1998. She has served as she's served Episcopal and Presbyterian parishes throughout Idaho. Currently, Karen serves as the vicar of Grace Episcopal Church in Nampa, Idaho. And the connection here is that Grace Episcopal Church created the house next door, literally by purchasing the house next door. So here's a picture of the house next door, and you can also see on the far right-hand side of it the church. The far left-hand side of it, you can see the house. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kat and to Karen. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Bart. I think Karen is going to start with the why we got involved in the how part, since she was with the church at that time.
At Grace Church, we had done quite a bit of work with the Hispanic community, and particularly with undocumented immigrants and their families. And we particularly were doing work out at Farmway Village, which was at that point in time a housing authority. The basis for that, as far as our gospel inspiration for that, is all those stories of Jesus, who was always taking people across the lake. He was always taking them away from where they were to people not like them and spending time there. And so what we have found is that this call to do ministry with people not like us is foundational in the gospel. And again, as Megan was saying, it's transformative. So out of the thing we find is that you start one ministry, which leads to another ministry, which leads to another ministry, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of how the house next door came about, is that because of our work with Hispanic families and out at Farmway, one of the things that we discovered is that this need for young women who hadn't gotten a good education and were often single mothers and struggling to make ends meet, to be good parents, to have a good life. And research basically shows that the one factor that is profoundly helpful in terms of whether you are economically kind of safe and happy in your life or not is education. And what we found out Farmway is that there are some young women who have the family support to do that, and there are some single moms who do not have the family support to do that. And so the house next door came up for sale. And actually, the church is not even the one who bought it. We found a donor who bought it for us. And so I want to, sometimes when we're thinking, we go, oh, we could never afford that. Well, we couldn't afford it. And somehow we managed to make it happen anyway. So when Megan was talking about transparency, I think that is so important. We had all kind of ideas and things and people enthused about this. But before we made the decision to do this ministry, we had an entire congregational meeting. And at Grace, we really try to do things by consensus. And so we just put it out there. Here's our idea. Here's the details that we know. What do you think? And we got so much support from women in the congregation who at one point in their lives had been single moms, that that was gratifying. The people who are a little more cautious raise those concerns. We listen to those concerns, but in the end, everyone agreed that if we were to go forward, everyone would be supportive, and we agreed to go forward. It was wonderful to be able to hire Kat because of her particularly being a deacon, because we really want to understand this work as a ministry, not as a kind of a social work project. And so, when we're meeting in person, Kat is in the congregation at least once a month, sometimes preaching, assisting with worship, talking about what's happening with moms and the children next door. Sometimes those moms and children have become active in the community at Grace. Sometimes they haven't. People at Grace are on the board. We had to move the House Next Door into being its own nonprofit a couple of years ago for legal reasons, but we continue to house their office and be profoundly connected. Kat.
Yeah, thanks, Karen. I think I will echo that, just the transformative nature of ministry when you're working with people, partly in the proximity, like Megan said. So I love that picture because it shows the church, and then the trees are kind of obscuring the office building, which is in between, and then the house next door. And one of the images of diaconal, kind of that service ministry, is a bridge. And so working here, I just kind of always mentally see this bridge between the church and the house. And I think that speaks to what God is doing in the Spirit, how the Spirit is moving. Church people are moving over to be helpful in the house, and people from the house are coming over to be helpful in the church. And it's just really this fluid thing where I'm not sure that would happen as organically if, again, like the house were not right next to the church. So that is a really lovely piece of that. Impact-wise, besides kind of us accompanying these families and observing their transformation, we are also transformed, and I think humbled by what they've been through and how strong they are, and just the courage and persistence they have to continue to do what's best for them and their kids. That house probably doesn't quite show you, but we have actually 3 floors. It's a pretty large house. So we can house up to 4 families at any one time. During COVID, we're only housing 3 just because of the CDC guidelines. So we can separate families by floor, and they each have their own bathroom. But we have laundry on site. We have 3 bathrooms, 4 bedrooms, kitchen, dining, living room. We have a playroom downstairs. We have also kind of a separate study room, and the backyard is really lovely as well. And we were thankful to get some grants and some Thrive in Action teams to help pull a playground together. So it's really come a long way in the 5.5 years since it started. And I think that just also speaks to how God can continue to work in the ministry and in the community and bring those together. Since we opened in 2015, we've served 16 moms and 27 kids. And we had 5 babies that were actually born while we were at the house. So that's always exciting, and another way that we can kind of wrap around these moms. And I guess one last kind of biblical piece before we'll go into what to share with others is part of what I love about being a deaconess is the focus on serving those at the margins, the most vulnerable. And I think the house next door is really a great example of how you can do that. And then how people kind of move out of the margins. Sometimes it doesn't take a lot to be helpful. So we just provide the rent-free housing, and we walk with them and help the moms get whatever it is they need. We help, if they need support getting birth certificates or getting their kids in a better daycare, whatever it is, we try to just meet them where they're at and help do what we can do to move them to wherever it is they're going on their journey. Yeah.
Okay. I think that what I would share with everyone who's kind of thinking about what they might do is there's big ways to do this, this ministry, like, Trinity New Hope. And there are small ways like the house next door. If you have a house, and some of us have houses, and you even house one family, that makes a difference. I think the challenge always is to see the particular need that your congregation sees in the particular way you see it, to, like I said, have a lot of conversation, to make sure that everybody is on board as best you can, and to do what you can. One small thing leads to another thing, leads to another thing. And I think that that's such an important thing to think about, as opposed to, golly, we can't do this big thing.
Yeah, and I would say too, it doesn't necessarily have to be all ready at the get-go. There's been a lot that's happened at the house physically since we started 5 years ago. And I think if we had thought we had to take all those pieces on initially to even start the ministry, it would have been super overwhelming. So in some ways, I think we didn't even realize all the things that maybe needed to happen to keep kind of upgrading this 1930s home. And in some ways, I think maybe that was a blessing, because we might never have gotten it off the ground. And even like the filing for our own 501c3, that happened just kind of as a specific thing with the Episcopal diocese and qualifying for grants. But that came later. And kind of to echo again what Megan said about knowing people in your community, there will be those people that can help you with each kind of need along the way. So I guess that's my final encouragement moment.
Okay, well, thanks, Kat and Karen. I'm giving you a congratulations, like live here, but everybody else is snapping their fingers and clapping their hands, and they're behind their mute buttons. Thanks so much for your thoughts there. I think it's super helpful. I love that. I love that you said that some of the parts that you didn't know, like about upgrading a 1930s house, actually may have been limiting factors for you to even get started in the first place. I love that that maybe embracing some of the not knowing might have been the sweet spot about getting the ministry off the ground. So I know maybe a lot of you are hearing about the house next door, maybe even for the first time. But what a neat ministry, and with a really specific focus. So on to our third panelist, Joe Bankard. Joe Bankard is a senior pastor at Collister United Methodist Church. It's located in Northwest Boise. In addition to being the pastor at Collister, Dr. Bankard is also a philosophy professor at Northwest Nazarene University. He has been at NNU since 2007. And after the church, after over 100 years of consideration about what to do with a small parcel of vacant land that the church owned, they decided to partner with Leap to complete a 2-unit infill housing project that is currently in process. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Bart. I'm not sure about the rest of you, but I've gotten to hear the presentations given earlier a couple of times, and every time I'm inspired. I feel so grateful to be a part of this group, to get to present, to see God moving in the work of Trinity Lutheran, in the house next door. I mean, this has been a really awful year. And I need to hear these stories and be reminded that God is still at work. And so I'm really grateful. As Bart mentioned, I'm bivocational. So I have been a professor at NNU for about 14 years. I took over as lead pastor at Collister United Methodist Church about 4.5 years ago. And I'm only quarter time. So it's a very small congregation. Pre-COVID, we had maybe 70 people on a Sunday. So there's no full-time pastor at this church or staff. But I say that only to highlight how much can get done partnering with nonprofits like Leap and how that can function. So when I became the pastor, we have a parking lot. You can kind of see that in the middle of that diagram. And then above it, you see the diagram of 2 homes. Right now, that is a goat head field. That is nothing but weeds. And it has been that way since 1913, when George Collister donated the land for it to become a church. So since World War I, this land has sat there, and there's never been a clear vision about what could be done. So we gathered together, myself, and then we have a lay-run church. It's a church council of 10 to sort of figure out what we wanted to do. And so we thought the best thing was to get as many ideas on the table. So we looked at what it would cost to turn it into a park, that area, with some shade, some swings. The neighbors could use it. We could use it for potlucks. We got a landscape architect to draw up plans and give us estimates. And then we looked at maybe, do we need more parking? What would it take to turn it into a parking lot? Which was the most expensive option, which surprised me. It's very expensive to do it up to code. We talked about a community garden. Like, what if we created boxes and invited neighbors and others? We could maybe partner with a school and we could garden together. And what would that take and what would that cost? So after looking at all these options and getting estimates, we began to which of these fit our mission? So the church has a mission, and which fits best, and what can this look like? So in the midst of all of that, I heard about affordable housing from another United Methodist pastor, and they had talked with Bart a little bit, and so I was sort of picking their brain, and it sounded very interesting. So I met with Bart, we had coffee, and he began sharing with me various options. And over the course of the coming weeks, as I shared that with the church council, it became clear that this was the option that was most captivating. It wasn't just something that was going to help our congregation. If we put houses here, we would help the entire neighborhood. We would help families, not just one day a week or one potluck a month, but every single day, 365 days a year. Our mission to be a light to our community, to show the love of Christ to those who need it most. Housing fit that mission so much better than a community garden, which is a great idea, but wouldn't meet the need nearly the way housing would. So we began to transition in that direction. And then over time brought it to the congregation. And when we took it to a vote, we had an almost unanimous support. I think we had 3 total dissenters. So it was like a 95% approval, which, if you know, working with churches is near impossible. I couldn't even get that kind of approval for what hymn to sing or whether to use drums in the service or something. So it felt like the Spirit had moved through this congregation, and they had sort of captured this vision. Some of the nuts and bolts, like if I were you, what I would want to know, one of the things that was very helpful early on was, our church is small. We can't even afford a half-time pastor. I'm quarter time, right? We don't have a lot of money, but we have paid no money out of pocket. It didn't cost our church anything. The agreement between Collister and Leap is we are going to lease the land. So we divided the land. You see the church building in that diagram, the parish, and then the parking lot. That's all one plot of land. And then above it, we divided that at the city and are going to lease that land to Leap. 50-year lease, so that the houses that are built there must be used for affordable housing for at least the next 50 years. We are not asking for money for the lease. I think we're going to get $1 a year from Leap. So it's basically free. We just want to ensure that it's affordable housing for the foreseeable future. So that was one element to me, is that we're not going to go broke from this, right? We're essentially entrusting this to Leap. Leap Charities is the one who has done most of the work with the city, going through planning and zoning, working with ACHD, which is like curb and gutter and sidewalk. I've been privy to all of those meetings, but I have not done the bulk of the work. Leap's the one who has written grants, is raising the money for the project. The church is not doing that. Our hope is that we get to partner with the people that move into these houses and love on them, invite them into a community if they choose to be a part of it. But we're not going to be the landlord. We're not going to be the ones collecting rent. We're not going to be the ones evicting. All of that is part of Leap's property management wing. So they're taking on the bulk of the responsibility. At the end of the 50-year lease, if the church at that time decides, the land and the structures will go back into the ownership of the church, and they can do something else, and they can repurpose those homes, or they can repurpose that land. It really did not feel like a giant risk to me. This felt like a no-brainer. I felt like all we're doing is saying we're trusting a local nonprofit that we're going to partner with to build affordable housing and manage it for the next 50 years. We're not making a giant financial investment. We're not losing the land permanently. We're not giving the land away or selling it. We're only leasing it. So future pastors will have an opportunity to do something different if the Spirit moves in a different way down the line. So I've had a wonderful experience. I'm bivocational and I'm only quarter time. I've not been stressed out by this project. This has not flooded my workload such that I can't get other things done. Far from it. We haven't cut any ministries. I haven't been pressed for time. I feel like this partnership has been really a blessing. So my encouragement to you is to consider this. If you have land that you are not using or not using very often, you might have a parking lot that you don't use all of it, right? You might think, well, that's only a small plot. I mean, I think we only have a half acre back there, maybe 0.7, right, acres. And so you can do a lot more than you think with that land. And I would like you to prayerfully consider using it for housing. It's probably Boise's biggest need at this point, and it's not going away. It's only going to get worse as the city grows. So prayerfully consider it.
All right, thanks, Joe. I really appreciate it. Those are some great comments. I just want to pause and just say thank you to Megan and to Kat and to Karen and to Joe for sharing your thoughts, your stories, and your inspiration today. Like Joe mentioned, I've heard these stories before. I know these folks who are presenting to you today. And every time I hear them, I still end up being energized and encouraged about what's happening right here in our own backyard, in God's backyard, right? Continuing with that theme, and so it's really, really exciting to see faith communities tackling this affordable housing challenge. And so I want to share sort of on the same theme as Joe, asking folks to sort of prayerfully consider utilizing excess land for affordable housing. I want to just sort of you've heard a lot of different ideas and really a full sort of world of potential, and I'm sure there's a lot of things going through your mind, but we've tried to narrow it down into just sort of 3 potential action steps that a faith community could consider. And so I just want to share those with you, and hopefully this, maybe this gives you a way, maybe a handhold to be able to go from. But 1, co-create affordable housing with excess land or buildings. So that's a good starting point. That's one strategy. Another strategy is if that's not something that the community has access to, they can financially support a housing project, a LEAP housing project, or an affordable housing project of a different sort. And then also third, if land and buildings and financial support aren't possibilities, time, energy, talent, and advocacy are really, really incredible resources to the work of solving the housing challenges in our community. And as Joe mentioned, with that example of the work that LEAP is doing alongside of Colchester United Methodist Church, if some of your first questions are, well, we can't do that because we're not a developer, we're not a builder, we're not a property manager, we don't have the resources to do this. Know that LEAP has found a really unique role to play to be able to come alongside faith communities throughout the Treasure Valley, and we can kind of point to some of the examples of where we're working alongside, so that the church can really do what it's made to do, while we can come alongside and provide all that technical expertise around building, developing, financing, and structuring that piece of it. We have this sort of common overlapping goal of serving vulnerable populations in our community, and we're able to sort of leverage those 2 things together to be able to accomplish that goal. So here's sort of just sharing a potential next step here before we go into the Q&A section. So today was meant to be discovery. Like, let's hear about some ways that faith communities are actually working to solve housing challenges in the community. We would argue that the next step in that process is exploration. So we go from discovery to exploration. And what we've learned is that our experience working with faith communities is that really this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. There just isn't anything sort of repeat over and over and over. So we know that every community has unique needs and desires. And so what we want to suggest is that you could reach out to us and we can put together an exploration call. So instead of a group call like this would be a call just with you, an individual from your faith community or a group. And we would look to explore really what does it look like to engage in affordable housing in some way, shape, or form. So it doesn't have to look a particular way, but we want to just share that that we can take that next step by meeting together and doing an exploration call. You could text our number, you can call our number, you can email, you could even say a note in the chat that you want to set up a meeting. That'll get the ball rolling for us to set something up to speak further with you about how we might be able to help at least point you in the right direction or partner alongside you to be able to help create housing. We may try to make it as straightforward and easy as possible. That's kind of the next step there. So with that, of course, our hope is that, through some, excitement and inspiration today, that you would consider saying yes to affordable housing in God's backyard. And now we want to just move our way into the Q&A phase of this conversation. And I believe Brittany has a few questions that she wants to start with, and she's going to read those ones off. If you do have a question and you haven't typed it in, don't forget to put it in the chat bar there, and then Brittany will sort of work through those questions, and then we'll just kind of take it from there and see how much time we've got left.
All right. So our first question is for Megan. And they are asking, how easy was it to negotiate with Idaho Housing and obeying their commandments? And then another one for you, Megan, was, can you explain Section 42 housing? Okay,
well, I'm going to do the first one and the second one because it's easier. So Section 8 is low income. Section 42 is affordable, or what Idaho or HUD thinks is affordable. We can argue with them about that. So it just means that we can charge more in our rent than, say, Nampa Housing Authority would for their, that's the easiest way to explain it. It was very interesting when we went back to IHFA. Julie Williams, who now I think is retired, had been the original signer 20 years ago on this project. And she was still with Idaho Housing, and they were fabulous to work with, actually. One of the calls that I made when I talked about who to call, I knew we were going to need some legal help in all of this. And I knew that Emmanuel, one of our sister congregations in downtown, had some attorneys. So I called one of them and they said, well, actually what you need is somebody who specializes in real estate law in Canyon County. So here's the number of the person that you should call. So that was very helpful. And so working with IHFA was actually easier than some of our issues actually came up with more with the Canyon County tax assessor's office. And our lawyer helped us with all of that. But things vary across the valley, and some of those people are elected. And there had been some issues in Canyon County, as some of you, I've talked about this as I'm seeing your faces and names on the screen. People had kind of abused the affordable housing, 20, 30 years ago, and our tax assessor's office still remembers all of that. So, but IHFA was helpful. We were able to hire somebody who had worked for Mercy Housing to be our property manager, and that was huge because she knows all the rules. So those would be my answers.
All right, thanks, Megan. We also have a question for Joe, and it is, does your denomination have to have a trust clause in place that you had to negotiate in order for the local congregation to lease the land to LEAP?
I don't know about, it's possible there's a trust. So I'm like an outsider in some ways, right? So I don't know all the ins and outs of the United Methodist Church. I'm a local licensed pastor, not ordained, but I had to get approval. In other words, I'm not the person who signs the lease. The district superintendent of my region has to sign it after she gets approval from the denomination. So like right now, the lease agreement is currently being looked at by denominational lawyers before it'll be signed. And that those hoops have to go through, right? Because the United Methodist Church owns the land Collister sits on. Collister doesn't own it. But the UMC has been really great to work with. So my experience has been, I've had tons of support, and they've really worked with us to try to make this happen. So.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe. And then another question we had was, I think this would probably go to Bart. What kind of input does the church have when it comes to the development and management of the properties? So you did mention like the more like property management and those types of responsibilities. Is there any other input the church would have?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. There is an opportunity for some input. There's probably I would say there's some limitations because there is a fairly uniform process for, especially if we could be talking about rental housing, or we could be talking about home ownership. So there are some, constraints around that. So we have a fairly specific policy that we work through in terms of screening tenants and determining whether a tenant is eligible for the property depending upon the funding source. We're working to be compliant with federal fair housing laws and so on and so forth. But we do find that there's some opportunities for the church to engage in the ways that they might be excited. So if the church maybe has an existing relationship with a rapid rehousing provider, we've seen an inclination to want to work with a rapid rehousing provider. We've seen where churches have natural rhythms of care baskets that they like to give to community members. They're able to move some of those resources and some of those rhythms towards the property itself. The thinking is that through our sort of technical services, we're able to kind of lift that burden off the shoulders of the church. The church doesn't have to think about collecting rent or screening tenants and completing applications and determining whether somebody's eligible or not eligible for the housing. So all of those components we're able to sort of put into one big basket. And then above and beyond that is where I think there's opportunity for creativity. Sometimes we're talking about, especially if it's a church property, there's some opportunities for, shared common spaces that create some neat opportunities for interaction and connection and relationship. Give you an example. There's the project that Joe's talking about at Collister. We've intentionally designed the front of the space because it's at the rear of a parking lot, but we've created where all the garden beds will be like located in one area. There'll be these raised garden beds so that the members of the people who are living, the residents and that are living in the homes, have an opportunity to do some gardening and participate in that way. And so those will all be ready there, but they're specifically located instead of the back corners in the front, so that we are creating some sort of flow, the design of the project, that not only there's interaction with your neighbors. So the thinking is, we want people to know their neighbors and be connected from that perspective. But because there's activity at the at the church throughout the week and stuff, there's opportunities to interact there, so that it doesn't feel like the houses are just sort of existing at the back of the parking lot. There's some opportunities to the extent that the residents are comfortable, that there's some interaction with other people, with neighbors.
All right. Another question is, what kind of land size is useful? 1 acre, half acre, for building projects?
I can take that one too. I think it's a good question. We are increasing. Well, we're increasingly surprised because it really depends on the size of it really depends on the zone. It's really ultimately at the end of the day. So you could have a really large tract of land that only allows 5-acre lots, and you wouldn't get very much housing there. But we've looked at as small as a 5,000 square foot lot that has commercial zoning or commercial designation that would allow us to go 4 stories and build 20 or 25 units. So there really is no one size fits all. It's different. And again, this is sort of one of the technical components that we can help with, is to say, here's what we've got. And we can evaluate it and say, okay, this is what the sort of the best use might be with that site, and we can kind of help evaluate that component of it. So it's probably where it gets into a little bit of a science, little art and science kind of combined there, to figure out what the maximum use is of the property. So I would say really any size. If it's excess, meaning there's let's see, we would say excess would be like if you think it's not obligated to be used for a certain purpose. So for example, if it was a buffer on the side of a building that you think is probably a setback from the neighboring parcel, that might not be a usable area. But if it's land that's behind a parking lot, or even sort of what you might see as overflow parking, all of that is worth looking at. And what we would do is go through and determine if there's any restrictions on what you can and can't do with that land, and then we would determine how much really is excess, to be able to see what the potential impact is on not only the design and where it would be located and how you would organize that, because then you also have to think about things like bringing in utilities and such, but also how many units could we actually serve. Joe's is an interesting one because they're the reverse. That is it's actually a pretty decent sized piece of property. The total size is an acre, and the church takes up kind of a corner of it. So there's probably as much as a half of an acre in the back, but it's in an area in Northwest Boise called the Sycamore Overlay. And the Sycamore Overlay, and then specifically in that Collister neighborhood where it's located, has intentionally a lower zoning. It's meant to have large lots throughout the neighborhood. And so as a result, on in another part of the city, you might have been able to get a dozen housing units on. And this location, we can just only get 2, and that's what was allowed by the city. And when we're thinking about it, as much as you could push and say, oh no, we really want to put 12 here, let's really push to get more density, there's a equilibrium we were trying to strike, which is what's good for the neighborhood, because we view ourselves, and just like the church does, as a really, really long-term neighbor. We're going to be around for a really long time. Leap is meant to be perpetual. We're not supposed to expire at any time. Leap will in theory be operating and owning real estate on the affordable housing side in the Treasure Valley forever. And that's at least what we're built for. And so when we think about it, we want to make sure that what we put into neighborhoods really is cohesive in a way that it fits, that it really blends and is appropriate for the surrounding area, instead of standing out, because we don't think that's a service to the residents that will ultimately live in the housing.
All right, Bart, I think you can answer this next one as well. How is LEAP funded?
Oh, good question. Well, we are funded, a large portion of our funding comes from the community. So individuals, just like people on this call, make donations to our organization. LEAP is a 501c3, a nonprofit. We're considered under a HUD designation, what's called Community Housing Development Organization, CHODO for short. And So we're funded through donations. We were the number one. We won the Avenues for Hope campaign. If you ever follow that, the IHFA has an end of year campaign this last year, and we raised basically kind of crowdfunding funds that help fuel our organization through the year. And then in addition to that, we're provided, we apply competitively with other organizations for federal funding. So probably our largest source of funding, because as you can imagine, building and developing housing is really capital intensive. Our largest single funding source comes from accessing federal funding. And most of that all kind of funnels through, you can imagine, HUD programs, if you're familiar with housing and urban development. And that gets delegated down into local jurisdictions here, City of Boise, City of Nampa, IHFA, other organizations, but they're programs that are funneled up through the HUD program.
Okay, the next question is, can these be classified as accessory dwelling units? Say if a congregant has a property that would accommodate one.
Yeah, you're about ADUs, is that accessory dwelling units? Is that what was, okay. So that's a great question. We have wondered this exact question. I don't know if we have an exact answer yet from an ADU perspective. Our sort of working knowledge of ADUs is that it's often a housing product that's afforded for an owner occupant. So if I own a home and I want to build an ADU in my backyard, it's usually allowed, usually because I'm the occupant as well. We don't usually see ADUs at, say, for example, an investment property. There's not an ADU. That would just be another unit. So in this case, it's really about how the city views what owner occupancy is. We have wondered if we could argue that the church, because it's not an individual, could argue it's an owner occupant, but so far we haven't been successful with that. From an ADU perspective, if we're talking about church property, we would just be asking what is the allowable uses for that property in that current zone, and if assuming residential is one of them, how many units would be allowed to be built. So it would fall outside of the ADU provision. It would fall in just more traditional like zoning, the zoning process.
Okay, so this might have been covered a little bit already, but can you talk more about LEAP's role in city permitting and planning and zoning meetings and things like that?
So city planning and zoning.
It's in the chat if you want to read it.
Oh yeah. So again, that's just sort of one of the technical roles that LEAP would be happy to play. So if you think about it, we work through it would be considered a 4-phase process internally. So our construction and development team starts with concept. And then the concept phase, we're evaluating a project to determine whether you can actually build housing on it. And so part of that is understanding the feasibility, the likelihood of approvals from planning and zoning. So in our concept phase, we do 3 feasibilities: financial, construction, and then what we call entitlement. And entitlement would be basically what can you do with the property? So zoning and planning and zoning. Then when we go into the next phase, the control phase, where we have an agreement to move forward with a project, we take care of all of the permitting, zoning, entitlement, that whole process. So for example, if project has to go to a planning and zoning meeting and there's a public hearing, we would be the speaker on behalf of the applicant. If there's a neighborhood meeting, we host the neighborhood meeting. We provide all the feedback and answer questions. And we submit all the applications and do that whole piece of it. That's part of our sort of technical bundle of services we would provide, or we do provide.
Okay, and then we have a couple questions regarding the lease. Bart, if you want to look at those in the chat, but just kind of talking more about this long-term lease plan, and what's the continuity of programming plan?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. I was just reading the two questions there. I might need just a little bit of clarification. The lease. So the most common what we call ground lease that we see is really a 99-year lease. Is the most common ground lease that we see. Our federal funding sources usually have a period in which the property has to be affordable. So with the longest program that we have has a 40-year period of time, and that's the low-income housing tax credit program. And so usually the requirement of the funder is that the lease is at least as long as the affordable period, but most likely longer. So when we think about a 40-year period, we're thinking about 50 years is sort of like the minimum length of term. In an ideal world, and this just doesn't always work, but in an ideal world, the land could be donated to LEAP and held in the LEAP Housing Trust. And if we did that, it would guarantee, because the LEAP Housing Trust exists for the purpose of creating perpetually affordable housing. So its goal is just to hold land or property for the purpose of affordable housing into the future. So that eliminates the risk that in the future, the church would decide something different than affordable housing for the use of the property. So that's like the ideal scenario. But what we found is that it's difficult, especially in a situation where the denomination holds the land in trust, of seeing the land donated in its entirety. So a ground lease does work. It is another strategy that will work and allow us to be able to pull together federal funding to be able to fund the construction. And so 50 is about as short of a term as the funders are interested in. And so what technically would happen is 50 years would go by. At the end of that lease, if the church said, we don't want to provide affordable housing anymore, there's what's called reversion happens. And the improvements, which are the buildings, they are reverted to the owner of the land. So if the church owns the land, leases it for 50 years, after 50 years, it gets the dwelling units would get handed over to the church. In our leases, there is extensions. So it's built to be able to have the church congregation in the future be able to say, yeah, we want to continue doing this, so keep doing what you're doing, and it extends out over time. We don't usually go into it, at least we haven't gone into it yet, where it's really clear and stated that the church intends to terminate the lease at the end of that term. It's sort of meant to say that we're going to push this way out into the future, but we're not going to make the final decision on the land by giving it away or putting it into the housing trust. We're going to still allow future generations to be able to make those decisions going forward about how to use the land. There's those two people that asked that question. Will you, while we go into the other questions, will you let me know I think that's what you were getting at. If I missed it, please let me know, and I'm happy to clarify any further.
And Bart, I can talk about like our experience with a 50-year ground lease. I don't know if that's
sure. Yep.
So that's what Trinity did long before I got here. We went into a 50-year ground lease agreement with $1 a year, which I don't know if we ever got it, with Mercy Housing. And then, halfway through, they said, we want to get out of town and we want to buy the land from you and sell that land and the houses to a third party. And the agreement had always been after the 50 years, the houses would have depreciated and Trinity could have bulldozed them or come up with a new partner or whatever. So, and nonprofits do change, but then there's new ones that come along. So we said, no, we'll buy the houses from you with the help of IHFA and create a separate nonprofit. So then we had to go to the county and like have the lines drawn and separate the land. But there is something in the, like, registered with the county that after that funding, that HUD funding, after that 50-year period, because that's still, that regulatory agreement is still in place, that Trinity Lutheran Church gets the, like, we get the say. The church gets to make a decision. We made sure that voice was still there, because it's our neighbors and it's been part of our ministry. And so anyway, I kind of think I loved it. I mean, I loved it when I came and they told me that story, and I was like, you were thinking 50 years ahead, like, that's great. And you were caring about housing. I love that. I mean, we do that when we build buildings, we think 50 years ahead. So.
I think that's great. That's really helpful. Brittany, do you have any questions on your end, or do you want to?
Yes, I think this one is for, so it says for all the organizations here. I'm guessing for Joe, Megan, and Kat is who they're directing it to. What would you say is the most challenging part of working with the populations you house? It's a good question.
Go ahead, Kat, or Karen, since I just talked.
I think,
Yeah.
I think that the first most challenging thing is that we always start these projects with the underlying assumption that we haven't really thought through that everybody's like us. That you might not have as much money or whatever, but basically you have my same values and my same experience, and you're like me. And then when we find out everybody isn't like us, our next assumption is everybody wants to be like us. And so if we can just, explain carefully how it is you need to change so that you're like us or like me or whatever, that you'll be so happy to have that knowledge. So I think that the difficulty is that you are constantly questioning, and needing to question your own assumptions about what is important, what is not important, what your task is, how it is you are doing bridge ministry, working with, where the boundaries are, where you should move where the boundaries are, where you should keep where the boundaries are. It's a constant self-critical learning curve on the part of the people doing the ministry.
Mm-hmm. I would also add that for us, and this might be different for the others, because we don't take any government funding, and so we try really hard. We kind of have guidelines for and criteria for what people can live here, but we also try to be really flexible and open to whoever God is bringing to apply at the house next door. And so I think initially the board probably thought like, oh, they're all single moms, they have this in common. And that is true. The other thing they probably have in common is some history of either childhood abuse or later domestic partner abuse. But otherwise they are completely different. We've had 16 or 17 families and none of their stories are really alike. They all have very different needs. And so being small and being part-time, that has been a challenge, but I think it's also been a joy to be reminded of the uniqueness of each family and each individual. And again, as Karen was saying, kind of keep us from assuming that everybody comes with these same things that they want to accomplish. Everybody's working in education, but some are becoming an HVAC technician, some are working on their master's degree, some are working on their GED, some are at CWI doing what we would consider like a regular, bachelor's degree. So it's just very diverse. And I think that's probably our challenge. So Joe, we'll pass it over to you.
I can't answer the question well. Only the houses have not been built and no one has moved in. So we're not really in relationship with those neighbors just yet. The project's still ongoing. So I'm looking forward to all the rewards we're going to get from working with these populations, the gifts and the blessings of being in community with these people. But I'm sure there will be challenges, but I don't know what they are yet. So.
It's hard. Like I agree with everything Karen said, but I just know that I had such a learning when we started this. And I remember thinking, oh, 6 months ago, Megan, you would have been like, yeah, those mean landlords, they're so awful. And now I'm like, we need rights too. Like, we want these buildings to stand. And yeah. And so I think just like figuring out what a different normal was, kind of what Karen said, but in a different way. And we do have federal money, so then it changes who we can, who lives there. For us, this is a benefit of being in a large, metropolitan area where multiple nonprofits are in existence. Like working with Catch and some of the other nonprofits has been great, because then like our property manager is not a social worker, nor do we pay her to do that. But if we have a Catch family move in, then we have somebody accompanying them, which is great. And there is a lot of transformation. I mean, like with that proximity and that physical space that you set up, that Collister is setting up, we've had block parties where we've had our residents just walk across the parking lot and we get to know them. And then, it's not those people anymore. They have names and that is beautiful and lovely and all those things. But it was definitely a learning curve for me, and it still is. So I serve on the board. So I hear, and I'm in the building. So then I hear lots of stories where our office is. But I went to a landlord training that I think the city of Boise put on, just so I could kind of learn some of the language and the rules. And I thought that was really helpful. And just to know that lots of people are doing this work. We weren't alone in this journey.
That's great. I'm just going to add that I think one of the challenges that we experience is just maybe stigmas around the population that we focus on serving. At 80% of our median income is is our core mission as an organization, and so we find that when we use the term affordable, low income, that it triggers a lot of stigmas, and it's real. The stigmas. I'm not saying that the statements or the opinions about this population are real. The fact that the stigmas exist, the fact that they're really felt by neighbors and by community members, oftentimes because of a lack of really interaction or maybe a dehumanizing of a large group of people. And so we are consistently kind of running up against that. And so I think that's one of our biggest challenges, is that it's just sometimes difficult because we have a couple of layers to get through before we can really do the exciting work of creating housing. So we have to partly prepare ourselves for kind of that level of pushback, and then we can move forward with what's beautiful, which is the creation of this new housing, and folks who maybe have really struggled to be able to access housing in the community now all of a sudden can call a place home. So anyways, I think that's one of our biggest challenges. It kind of relates, Brittany, if you think a little bit to this next question, which is how, asking the question, how can, like some examples, and this would be maybe for Megan, and I think Joe and even Kat, but how have you been able to build positive relationships with development resistant neighbors?
I can answer this one. And I'm sure others can too. One of the things that I was really appreciative about Leap and BART, they've done this before, so they anticipate there being some resistance. So we went door to door in our neighborhood, literally broke up the different streets for places that are within, 500 yards of the project, 700 yards, right? And we just sort of went knocking. We had a rough sketch. Is there questions? Why we're doing this? But in doing that, I found that lots of people who were neutral became much more supportive. Many of them said, wow, we really need more affordable housing. I'm glad this is happening. You know, my mortgage has gone up like crazy with property taxes. There's a couple of places that duplexes near the church that, you know, he said, if I didn't have this affordable unit, I don't know where I'd be. And he was with his daughter, a single dad. So we got support in that respect. And then the people that were resistant, we were able to, like, so one in particular, and they showed up to planning and zoning and testified against the project, that did not want it to happen. But because we went door to door, I had their number, and so did Bart. And so I engaged probably twice a week in phone calls with questions they had or concerns. I was able to listen and talk with them. And they were really concerned because there's this easement by the church that they use to get to their property that's technically the church's, but we don't, it's like the backside of the church, and we're fine if they use it. And they said, well, this is going to trigger ACHD and they're going to close it. And I said, listen, I want to work with you. I'll do whatever I can to keep this easement open. I want you to access your property. So in engaging that, we developed a partnership. So now, even though they opposed it at planning and zoning approved it. So we won, whatever that means. But I now have their phone number. So I've been able to contact them and say, guess what? We got that exemption. Your easement stayed open, right? And that's been an ongoing thing where I feel like the relationship, as much as we disagree about whether houses should go back there, the relationship I have with them is strong because there was communication well before we had to, well before the community meeting, and well before planning and zoning. And I thought that strategy really helped alleviate concerns that neighbors had. I mean, it's not going to eliminate all of them, but I think it helped pave the way for a smoother process.
I think that's a good point, Joe. What we find is that it's easy to give criticism or challenge and pushback in a vacuum, like behind a computer screen, on a Facebook page, like really disconnected. But when we sort of try to humanize all this and we give people a face with who's building and developing and why we're doing it, and we're communicative, we put information out there about what we're actually doing, how many units, what it's going to look like, what safeguards we have in place, that we can think through the kinds of kinds of challenges or concerns that people have. When they're communicated to, a lot of that disappears, and I think that's really a big deal. The other thing too is when we go out, we're going the disposition that, like, hey, we're investing in this neighborhood and we're going to be long-term neighbors here, so we want to make sure that the project fits. So if the neighbor shares something with us that we didn't know about, that they care about, that is going to change, we want to know about that because we want to try to make those shifts accordingly, because we ultimately want the project to be something everybody can be proud of. And so that's one of the things. Sometimes we just don't know what we don't know. We don't know that that this is a really, really important thing, that there's an easement behind the church, that they're really convinced it's going to go away if development happens. We don't have any reason to think it's going to go away, but we understand that that's an issue. So we need to talk about it and work through that process. So if we can get out ahead of time, it really becomes a much more collaborative process. I can think of specifically, there's design changes that happened to that Collister projects that are because of feedback given by neighbors. Oh, we'd really like you to see this. Or we'd really like to see that. Oh, great. That's really great feedback. And we were able to make those changes. They were really happy about it. They heard they were listened to. And then the ultimate design was changed based on their feedback. So they now see themselves in the project. And so that's really the kind of the spirit of how we have that adoption of the project itself, is that people begin to start to see their feedback and ideas in it.
That was a big issue 20 years ago when Trinity New Hope was built. What did the neighbors think? They weren't very excited about it. But I think I would hope that we would be one of the places you all could point to. I mean, the neighbors those 16 houses are in between a church and a middle school. So people were really worried. And 20 years later, well, all of their housing prices are just fine. And we have invested. I mean, we just took out a big loan and recited them all. I mean, so we take that seriously. We want to be a good neighbor. But I would hope it'd be a place that people could point to and say, no, affordable housing can look nice and it doesn't have to, it can enhance the neighborhood.
I think we'll just echo the communication. We're a little different because with the church and then the office and then the house next door, we take up half the block. Across from us is the funeral home. So they're not really, it's a little different being commercial. And then on the other side of the house is a very large house that's been turned into basically 4 apartment types. And so the owner of that and we've been in good communication and, just try to keep open communication as that continues. Usually if we're out doing things in the yard or whatever, say like, oh, how's it going? And we've had no issues with their residents. And he said, he's had great conversation with ours and is really supportive of what's happening. And then I think we just have that trust that if something was going on that, he wasn't okay with, he would be able to reach out and we could try and rectify that.
So I think another thing is that we've tried to be, and this has been kind of difficult for us to help our residents understand the sort of norms of the neighborhood in terms of, shoveling the snow and things like that, because some of those things that, and I know with Trinity New Hope, people have just had to be really clear about those expectations. And I think honoring the norms of the neighborhood and those kind of things has been really helpful.
Well, I think we have had no shortage of great questions, and I think that's all of them. I think that have been messaged in and also in the chat. There's probably time for just like one more quick question if someone's got one burning that they want to ask. Let's see if there's any last questions. Otherwise, we can wrap up. Of course, if you have any unanswered questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us and let us know. So unless there's any other, if you raise your hand or let me know if you've got a one last question. Otherwise, we are going to wrap up, and I just want to say thank you so much for participating today. Thank you for considering, saying yes to God, into God's backyard, to affordable housing, to exploring the idea of helping to ease this burden of the affordable housing challenge. So I can't tell you how much I appreciate you spending a full hour and a half of your day with us today. And we're just so glad you were here. Awesome questions, fantastic turnout. And I'm really, really looking forward to see how these conversations, where they go as the months and even the years go by, to see what sort of an impact faith communities will ultimately have in affordable housing in our community. So thanks again, and we really appreciate you being here. We hope you all have a great day.